Okay, good morning. Today we are going to talk about the methods of political economy in general, and of course we should start from, let me see, basically again Marx's early writing and Hegel's influence on Marx in general. And this is okay. Okay, I have this methodology discussion. Before starting, of course, we can briefly summarize the importance of Hegel on Marx, for Marx, I'm sorry. Okay, first idea is expressivism that we have talked about. Expressivism. Marx more or less loosely, at least, belongs to this tradition of expressivism, basically German idealistic tradition, maybe starting with Kant, well, even before Kant. There are some Enlightenment philosophers. Moses Mendelssohn, for example, is an interesting figure in this regard, and Moses Mendelssohn is the grandfather of the famous composer Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, and he's an important philosopher, Enlightenment philosopher, and he was a friend of Kant's, I guess, I'm not sure. So it's about the zeitgeist, maybe, the spirit of times, the essence of times, maybe. Okay, so starting with Kant, and Hegel is the most important representative of this tradition, and Marx can also be placed within this tradition, as we have said, but Marx tried to blend it, so to speak, or tried to reach a synthesis between German Enlightenment tradition, or the expressivist tradition in general, and French Enlightenment tradition, mostly, with the British one, of course, but French Enlightenment tradition can be identified with its radical notions about changing the society in general. If there's no freedom in the society as a whole, it's desirable for people to change this society. Similar views may appear in John Locke also, but French Enlightenment ideas are much more radical than those of British Enlightenment thought in general. So basically, according to this expressivist tradition, the totality of the essence, human essence, is important, and also there are some important aspirations or demands of this German expressivist tradition, such as the unity of man or human beings with nature and with society. People, human beings, are social beings. They try to realize their own essences, and freedom, of course, freedom in the sense of realization of human potentials in general. Tradition starts with Aristotle. And Enlightenment era actually is witnessed the rise or emergence of Greek thought in general. Well, Plato was more important for the Enlightenment tradition, maybe than Aristotle, but Aristotle, in some important ways, heavily also influenced Enlightenment thought, Enlightenment tradition in general, in all three strands. So anyway, this idea of realization of human potential is an Aristotelian notion, and goes back to Aristotle's metaphysics or ontology in general. Every being has the aim, objective, to realize its own potentials. This is no different for human beings. Human beings to try to realize their own potential so that they become free and they become full-fledged individuals and human beings. So Enlightenment tradition places a great, heavy emphasis on the notion of freedom, basically, in all three traditions at the same time, in different ways though. So the notion of expressivism is also important for Marx, because Marx tried to realize almost, intellectually speaking, of course, the aspirations of the expressivist thought through having a synthesis between or among the three traditions of the Enlightenment thought, French, English, and the German thought. So this idea of expressivism is important, especially Marx's views on alienation and freedom, species being, etc., are representatives, we can say, of the German expressivist thought, and almost all of them come from Hegel, actually, with the exception of the notion of objectivity. Remember, objectivity is the attempt at, or the process in which human beings express their own essences, in the sense that they try to produce something, which means actually they create something, anything. Production does not necessarily imply to production of goods and services only, but it can be understood as the production of lives in general, we can say. So human beings try to realize themselves through constantly engaging with nature and society, what Marx calls, in general, the relations of production may refer, or actually do refer, to these constant interactions of human beings with nature, and also this idea embraces the notion of intersubjectivity in the sense of interactions among people. So nature-mediated interaction within the society, or society-mediated interaction with nature, are one and the same process, actually, which is the objectification. In this objectification process, in a Hegelian way, people, human beings, recognize themselves. They recognize themselves in what they create in general, and also they recognize themselves in other people. That's the notion of intersubjectivity, which is the second important influence of Hegel's on Marx, which is the notion of this intersubjectivity, as in the master-slave dialectics. Again, human beings first, in the beginning, in a fictional example used by Hegel, of course, in the beginning they are alone, so they come together with other people, one other individual. And in this individual, the person actually recognizes himself that he has a consciousness different from others. This is true also for the other individual, but in this relationship, one becomes the master, the other becomes the slave. Master always needs the slave in order for herself to realize herself, to achieve a self-recognition or self-consciousness in general. In return, the slave does not need master in the same way as the master needs the slave, because it is the slave actually who carries out the production process. So he or she has an advantage over the master in creating something, in producing something, so that he or she can realize her own essence in a direct way, so to speak. But still, the idea of intersubjectivity and interaction among human beings actually is a Hegelian notion, and Marx was heavily influenced, as many people say, by this Hegelian tradition of the intersubjectivity. Another notion is, of course, the notion of dialectics. Dialectics imply actually, or embraces, three important concepts. One is the notion of becoming. It's an age-old problem in the history of philosophy in general, the distinction between being and becoming. In the notion of being, as in Plato's understanding of philosophy, there's no such thing changing. There's no such a notion as change in the reality in which we live. Change appears, change is a property of this reality in which we live, but actually in the real, so to speak, reality, the world of forms, according to Plato, there's no such thing as change, because if anything is perfect, already perfect, there will be no need for this being to change at all. That's the idea. And even before Plato, this debate controversy between Heraclitus and the Parmenides, for example, and his student, so to speak, Zeno, tried to show that there's no such thing as change. But Hegel is different from this tradition in the way that he actually places heavy emphasis on the notion of change. You know, the reality itself is a process. In this process, everything changes. And the basic idea in Hegel is, of course, the realization of the spirit and its potentialities, and spirit in this, throughout this process, the spirit comes to realize itself, that it achieves self-consciousness. So what we call history, including human history, both natural history and human history, is a process of change. Everything becomes, everything changes, everything transforms. So this is an important idea. This is an important idea also for political economy, even in economics, for example, these days. There's a growing tradition of what is called evolutionary economics. The notion of evolution is basically resting upon the notion of change or becoming in general. You know, according to Schumpeter, for example, one of the most important representatives or founders of the evolutionary economic tradition, argues that even in capitalist reality, everything changes. You know, the famous creative destruction process. Every time, you know, something is created and something is destroyed, that's exactly the notion of becoming. So this is a specific kind of metaphysics, the metaphysics of becoming in general. So this idea is important also for Marx. Marx also thinks that becoming is an important feature of history, both natural and human history. Although Marx does not say much about the natural history, or he doesn't talk usually about nature, but Engels, his close friend and collaborator, talks about nature and dialectics, etc., in his famous book, Dialectics of Nature. So this is another discussion. So this notion of becoming is important, the notion of change in general, or transformation, qualitative changes actually we are talking about here. And according to this dialectics notion, as a notion, contradiction is the basic drive behind the changes, or behind the processes in general, because Hegel thinks that it is the existence of contradictions within the reality itself that create change, that bring about changes and transformation. It applies to the movement, so to speak, of the spirit itself. Spirit undergoes through a constant transformation. It starts as a concept, so to speak, as a kind of consciousness, but which is not aware itself. Aware of itself, and later it becomes material world, and finally, through the synthesis phase, so to speak, the spirit comes to realize itself, its own essences. So this is the realization of the spirit as its essences. So it becomes free as the subject of history. Spirit is different. According to Marx, of course, this subject is not the spirit or any kind of cosmological or metaphysical entity, but human beings themselves. Human is the basic subject of history. Sometimes this creates a controversy within the Marxian literature, because many people think that it is the proletariat, actually, the working class, that is the real subject of history. So again, class as different from the individuals that constitute it, has a different ontological status than that of individuals. So we can see, just like spirit, or instead of spirit, we can see proletariat as the real subject of history, which is capable of bringing about changes and transformations. So history can be seen through the realization of class struggles in general. Proletariat is important for capitalism, but also in human history, at least Western European history. There have always been classes, with the exception of the primitive communism, the very beginning of human history, so to speak. And, with the emergence of slavery, the notion of class struggle became important. So any changes in societies, historical change in general, were created by these kind of struggle in the slavery, struggles between slaves and owners of slave, but even within the owners of slave, within the Roman society, for example, there were two different classes, patrigis, I guess, and plebs, higher and lower ranking of the free citizens, aristocrats, etc., are patrigis, and the remaining free citizens are the plebs. But even in Roman history, plebs also played important roles. For example, Caesar, Julius Caesar, if I'm not mistaken, comes from a plebeian family, and he played an important, of course, role to change the Roman society and also human history, right? Caesar is more or less responsible of the collapse of the Roman Republic, and it started the empire. He was no empire, he was killed, and his heir, Augustus, actually created the empire, and he became the first Roman empire, and so forth. That's the history. Again, this changes, the basic cause of these changes, according to Marxian thinking, should be sought in this class struggle about not the ordinary people I'm talking about, of course. Anyway, so history is subject to constant change, and these changes were created, or are created in general, by the existing contradictions and struggles among classes and contradictions within the societies that occur. Usually, Marx argues that the very basic contradiction in any mode of production or any kind of society is the contradiction within the economic base between the forces of production and relations of production, mostly between technology and relations of production or property relations in general. So even in capitalism, we have this contradiction because forces of production dictates a more socialized way of producing goods and services, whereas these products created within the production process are to be expropriated by a small minority within the society, the capitalists or bourgeoisie. So anyway, this notion of contradiction is also important for Marx as well. And of course, the last but not least is the notion of totality. Totality in general is to be seen a system, maybe, with internal relations, or the whole itself is important. Again, this is an expressivist idea in general, which was emphasized by Hegel. And in this process, Hegel, again, an understanding of totality is sometimes called as expressive totality by Sartre, I guess, if I'm not wrong. And it is this idea, there is this relationship between the parts and the whole. The whole is not simply the sum of the parts. This is the Aristotelian notion of the relationship between the parts and the whole. But in other words, this relationship is not linear, but according to the Hegelian or expressivist totality, the idea is that it is the whole which gives the parts their own meaning. So we exist and we act as human beings just by virtue of belonging to the whole of the society. We are social beings. So this is true for any totality. It's a kind of expressive totality because the part itself, the individual part of the system in general itself, expresses the whole, the notion or the spirit of the whole. So the movement or the actions of the whole are to be determined, the actions of the parts and the working of the parts in general are to be determined by the whole itself. This is the notion of totality. So society is much more important than individual. Even Marx himself in his book Das Kapital argues that, for example, he says somewhere, I do not depict individual capitalists in rosy colors. That's a colorful expression. According to Marx, capitalism is nothing but the personification of a social relation. This is true for the aristocracy and for the bourgeoisie and for the proletariat in general. So classes are important. Of course, this is another topic of debate within Marxian circles, whether the whole is more important than the part, or whether the individuals are also important. For example, recently in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s, a new tradition within Marxism, or the Marxian thinking in general, had emerged that is called analytical Marxism. Sometimes it's called rational choice Marxism. We know what rational choice is from our discussions of economics in general. We always, as economists, argue that or accept that individuals are rational beings. They try to maximize something and minimize some other thing, maximizing utility, minimizing spending, maximizing profit, minimizing, etc., etc. So that's the basic idea. And these guys, Romer, for example, and Bosengittes, argued that Marx was a methodological individualist. At first, he didn't argue for the importance of totality in general, but he take as the basic unit of analysis the individual's achievement. Of course, rationality principle is applied individual behavior. So the result is called analytical Marxism. Analytical Marxism is a broader tradition, actually, which also includes rational choice Marxism. Rational choice Marxism is a subspecies, so to speak, of the analytical Marxism. There are other people such as G.A. Cohen, who talks about historical materialism in general without any reference to individuality and so forth, but still they argued for the necessity of analytical philosophy in general. This is again a philosophical debate, two philosophical traditions. The analytical philosophy is mostly the British or Anglo-Saxon type of philosophy, which has a direct style, so to speak. It is not like the Hegelian philosophy. They're just to the point, and they try to develop their ideas in the most directed ways without recoursing to metaphors or some cosmological entities. They are mostly empiricists in their orientation and so forth. So basically, this distinction, economics is a distant, so to speak, representative of this analytical philosophy, I would say, maybe I'm wrong in a technical sense, but it's my feeling that. And analytical philosophy, for me at least, it is much easier to understand that Hegelian philosophy actually, but like me, these people, analytical Marxists, also try to apply analytical philosophy to the Marxian tradition in general. I'm not sure about the validity of this claim, but still, it may create some interesting insights. There's also this guy called John Elster, for example. And he's an important figure in this analytical Marxist tradition. But usually we can say that the Hegelian tradition or the European, in general, continental tradition is much complicated and more complicated than the analytical philosophy in general. So it's really understand, and behind this Hegelian idea, I would say, is the existence of totality, and the notion of totality is much more important for Marx than for this British tradition in general. Anyway, so these ideas, the notion of process or becoming, the notion of contradiction, and the notion of totality are important parts of the dialectical conception of reality and also its change. So these are important from a methodological perspective for Marx as well. So maybe now we can talk about why these ideas in general important in Marxist political economy, basically. Okay. Again, we were talking about the methods of political economy. Maybe we should start our discussion with Marx's emphasis on the difference between the real causal mechanisms and their appearances, their manifestations. You know, this is an age-old controversy between empiricism and rationalism. Maybe, well, not exactly rationalism, but rationalism is skeptical towards empirical methodology in general, empiricist methodology. I'm sorry, they say that basically what we perceive in general through our senses is not enough to reach knowledge. You know, Descartes is one of the most modern representatives of this tradition in general. Descartes argues that, we know his famous words, cogito ergo sum, I'm thinking, therefore I am. This is a proposition reached through thinking or reasoning only. You know, Descartes starts with this famous notion of suspicion, so to speak. He says basically, I can suspect that the reality exists. I can suspect that God exists. I can suspect that even I exist. But if I think this way, I say that I'm at least capable of suspecting, right? So it means that through my thinking, I can know something. So that's the basic idea in general. It's a crude representation of this idea, but I think that is enough. That's sufficient for our purposes. And also Leibniz, an important German philosopher again, who was one of the inventors of calculus, by the way. And he also made a Leibniz machine, which is the prototype of calculators and even computers, analog computers. One of the early one of the early species of analog computers. That's interesting. He was a very smart guy, and he believed in rationalism. He says that first we start with some first principles, which are known to be true without any further inspections, right? We are human beings, for example, so it may be a kind of first principle in the Leibnizian sense. Is it? I'm not sure, maybe. Well, anyway, something like that. We start from some first principles, and on the basis of reasoning, we produce some propositions and create knowledge, etc. Remember your microeconomics class? The notion of rationality is usually considered as a kind of rationalistic thought. Basically, we first assume that human beings are rational, but we try to uncover the hidden meaning within the notion of rationality, and we define three important properties of preferences, right? First we have this completeness of preferences. We assume that preferences are complete and they are reflexive. Any bundle is as good as itself. And we also accept that they are transitive. So on the basis of these three properties of the rationality assumption, we deduce the consumer theory, right? We start with the preferences, and through thinking, through reasoning, we get the idea of the utility function and maximize it, etc., etc. So that's the basic idea. Deduction is the most important methodology, method for reaching knowledge according to the rationalistic tradition in general, although they don't reject induction, especially as a mathematical argument, of course. But deduction is more privileged, I would say, than perceptions. Deduction, reasoning, thinking, etc. Empiricist tradition, on the other hand, is based upon the idea that only what we see, what we touch, etc., with our five senses, the knowledge can be acquired. So perceptions do matter in the production of knowledge. Of course, they don't reject the importance of deduction as well, but induction is more important in this process. The positivistic example is very famous. If we say that in order for us to say that all ravens are black, we have to make observations, right? The first raven that we see is black, the second, the third, etc. So that by collecting empirical evidence, we can say that, safely say that all ravens are black. David Hume is the most important representative of this tradition, empiricist tradition, even if David Hume himself is skeptical about the process of induction. He put forward the notion of the riddle of induction. Just because every single raven that we have observed so far is black doesn't necessarily mean that the next raven we are going to observe will be black as well. It may be white or in other color. I don't know. So that's the riddle of induction. So anyway, Marxian idea is simply that appearances or empirical evidence, our own observations through our sense experiences, are not enough to understand the reality, the working of the reality. And he has this famous passage from Das Kapital, Volume 3. Vulgar economy, according to Marx, is concerned with appearances, with empirical observations. What he calls vulgar economy may be what we may understand as neoclassical economics now, right? Neoclassical economics is concerned with appearances only, so that's why it's vulgar. But of course, Marx does not talk about neoclassical economics. It didn't exist in Marx's time. Well, it was emerging, but Marx, belonging to the classical tradition, was not aware of the existing of this tradition. He would hate it, by the way. Anyway, vulgar economy, according to Marx, actually does no more than interpret, systematize, and defend in doctrinaire fashion the conceptions of the agents of bourgeois production who are entrapped in bourgeois production relations. This is an interesting passage, actually, interesting sentence. Even the bourgeois itself is entrapped within capitalist relations of production. This is an important notion that would become useful to understand the Marxian notion of ideology at the same time, because ideology is a result of capitalist relations of production. So even the bourgeoisie, without being aware of these relations in a conscious way, although they are benefiting from these relations, are actually entrapped. This is a kind of slavery, right? Basically. Anyway, this is another point of debate. It should not astonish us then that vulgar economy feels particularly at home in the strange outward appearances of economic relations, in which these prima facie absurd and perfect contradictions appear, and that these relations seem to be more self-evident the more their internal relationships are concealed from it, although they are understandable to the popular mind. Marx loves this way of writing. But all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. So this italic was added by me. And it's an important methodological principle. He says basically there are two realms in the production of knowledge. One is the realm of the reality, the essences of things. He says, this notion is again an Aristotelian notion. According to Aristotelian metaphysics, as we talked already, there are some essences of anything, according to Plato, these essences actually belong to the world of forms, morph. So we cannot see them, we cannot observe them directly. So we should, in order for us to know about this world of appearances, we should start from what we observe, but we must know that what we observe, what we see, is always even deceptive. So in order to reach for ourselves to the knowledge of the world of forms, we should use our own thinking, again, rationalistic philosophy, maybe methodology, I would say. And according to him, of course, mathematics or geometry, according to the ancient Greeks, geometry is mathematics. Actually, they did not know what algebra, for example. They did not know about zero, etc. So geometry is the key for the knowledge of the world of forms in general. So this is a methodological reflex, if you will. So, but Aristotle thinks that what you say essence or the real essence of anything is inside that thing, so to speak. Even if you cannot observe them directly, they are the totality, actually, of the potentials of change, potentials of becoming, potentials that this thing, including human beings, have. So any being is directed in a teleological way, so to speak, to realize these essences. So that's the basic idea. The notion of essence is the real properties of the thing in question, whatever it is. It may be a human being, it may be a small acorn, it may be the society even, or the capitalist economy, according to Marx again. So Marx here is interestingly close to Plato. Marx, of course, hated Plato because Plato was idealist and Marx was a materialist. So Aristotle's philosophy is more important in this regard, maybe for Marx, because sometimes Aristotle is also called as materialist, although he argues of the coexistence of matter and essence, or the idea of the things within the same being, of course. So it's called hylomorphism. You know, hylo means matter, I guess. Morph is form, idea, whatever. So it's the coexistence of form and matter. So Marx is close to this metaphysical understanding, I would say. But from a simply methodological point of view, we can say that what Marx tries to do is to uncover what's existing behind these appearances. So Marx usually talks about the processes in the capitalist production that goes behind the backs of individuals. This is his expression in general. So we may not be aware of the existence of these relations, but they are real and affect our own actions in general. This is true for the proletariat. This is true also for the bourgeoisie, as this passage reveals, right? Even the agents of bourgeois production, you know, both workers and capitalists, are entrapped in bourgeois production relations. We may not be aware of it. This is actually closely related to the class consciousness conception, basically, you know, as we become aware of the existence of these relations of production, we become conscious about what's going on, what's really going on in the society, in the production, etc., etc. So this is basically Marxian idea. Again, our perceptions, our observations are not enough to understand what's really going on in the society, in nature, etc. So again, methodologically speaking, as a method for achieving knowledge, Marx interestingly follows Plato in this regard. This is actually an old, again, age-old debate, controversy in the history of philosophy, which is the debate between nominalism and realism. You know, there's this debate within the Catholic Church of the realism of the essentials. You know, we say that we use some terms, some notions such as good or bad, etc. Of course, the question emerges that whether these notions have any kind of actual reality, actuality, or is there a thing that is really bad? I'm not talking about the goodness or badness of something, but you know, the notions of bad and good, etc., or even God has some ontological status. That's the basic idea. So nominals actually say that these are just names. No nominal, you know, name, nomos. Oikos nomos, remember? Economics. So basically, these are just concepts that we find useful in expressing ourselves, etc. So we don't need to seek whether they exist or not, etc. So the idea of realism, there's a version of realism that is called scientific realism in general. Scientific realism argues that the notions or the entities, I'm sorry, that are posited by science actually exist. Well, an example would be the black hole, right? Until recently, black holes could not be observed directly, I mean, by directly through telescopes, etc., etc. But scientists, at least theoretically, argued the existence of these black holes. But recently, you know, there were some people, some scientists who actually took the picture of a particular black hole, and we know, I mean, human beings, scientists, physicists, whatever, know much more than their predecessors about the black hole. So whatever posited by the scientists, even if they are not observed directly, could exist. Well, this is a hypothesis. Of course, this hypothesis should be confirmed. Okay, so this is sometimes known as realism, scientific realism, and it is argued sometimes that Marx was a scientific realist. Especially this particular passage reveals the validity of this view. So I don't want to go into detail into this discussion, but there are some Marxists who argue that this is true, but there are some others, no, this is not relevant for Marx, etc., etc. Anyway, maybe it's better for us stop here and have some 10-minute break.